breaking news this morning is tied to the now impeachment investigation into President Trump. A lot of this renewed attention is focused on the president's phone call with the leader of Ukraine and whether there was an inappropriate ask during that call. Well, NBC's justice correspondent Pete Williams has just gotten a first look at the transcript of the call. Pete, good morning. Tell us how it is that you've had a look at this transcript and what you heard.
The so-called transcript, Savannah, these are the notes taken by the official note takers. They're not a verbatim transcript, but officials here at the Justice Department say it is as close to a transcript as is available. It's the best record of this call, made July 25th from the White House residence by President Trump to President Zelensky of Ukraine. The call lasted for about 30 minutes. And let me walk you through the call after having read the notes of the call. Trump begins by congratulating Zelensky for his election victory, and midway through the call says this, quote, "I would like to ask you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot, and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of your wealthy people, the server. They say Ukraine has it." Now, frankly, it's hard to tell exactly what the president means. DOJ officials weren't able to shed much light on it, what he meant at this point, but perhaps he is thinking that somebody in Ukraine has one of the missing Clinton email servers. Frankly, it's impossible to tell. And then there's one reference to Biden in this call. And by the way, the entire call transcript is about 5 pages, even though the call lasts for 30 minutes. It's a back and forth between the two of them. Trump says this. He says, "I heard you had a prosecutor who was very good and was shut down, which is really unfair." And then he says, quote, "There's a lot of talk about Biden's son, what Biden stopped the prosecution. And a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the attorney general would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution. So if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me." Now, this is the only mention in the call about Biden in this 5-page transcript. And Zelensky replies that he's appointing a new prosecutor who will soon, quote, "look into the situation." Now, here's what happened according to these DOJ officials. Somebody in the intel community heard about this call, not firsthand, but the intel official said he or she heard about it from White House officials and complained to the Inspector General of the intelligence community, suggesting that it could be a violation of campaign finance law. Something was soliciting a foreign contribution. But the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel concluded that the complaint didn't meet the narrow technical standard for passing on a complaint from the intel community to Congress because it wasn't an intelligence activity. It didn't it didn't involve an intelligence employee. But, and this is something we learned today here, the Justice Department said the appropriate thing to do was to refer the matter to the Justice Department's criminal division, and that's what happened. And according to justice officials here, they say this morning that the criminal division, including career employees, concluded that there was no campaign finance violation in this call. They did so after looking at the call, talking to people at the White House about the call, and they concluded that what the president was asking Ukraine to do did not amount to a thing of value, which is what the law would require in order to be the solicitation of a foreign contribution to a campaign. So DOJ said it asked the White House for notes of the conversation and that the White House voluntarily turned them over, and this conclusion was apparently reached here at Justice last week. Now, Trump said in the call that he wanted Rudy Giuliani, his lawyer, and Attorney General William Barr to talk to President Zelensky of Ukraine. But the Justice Department says Barr only found out about the call several weeks after it was made, when the matter was referred here to the Justice Department for investigation, and that Barr has not spoken to the president about this, about Ukraine, or investigating anything relating to former Vice President Biden or his son. The Justice Department says the president has not asked Barr to contact Ukraine on this or any other matter, and it says that Barr has not communicated with Ukraine about this or any other subject, or And they also say he's not talked about this with Rudy Giuliani. Now, one other note here, Savannah. The Justice Department says it does not know to this day the identity of the whistleblower. That's known to the Inspector General. But they say in the letter from the Intelligence Committee's Inspector General to the Director of National Intelligence about this, which was forwarded to the Justice Department, the IG himself says there is, quote, some indicia of arguable political bias on the part of the person who made this complaint.
Well, a lot to unpack there, and I don't want it to go over the heads of, well, my head or anybody who is listening. So, Pete, with what you've just given us, let's turn to Peter Alexander at the White House. And, Peter, let's try to set this up a little bit farther now. Now we have the context, perhaps, the notes on the call that took place between President Zelensky of Ukraine and President Trump back in July. And the allegation from Democrats is, and based on some public reporting, in particular in the Washington Post, is that military aid was withheld by the U.S. to Ukraine, and then a week later this phone call takes place, and the allegation is that it is inappropriate for the president to have essentially asked Ukraine's president to look into a matter that would be potentially damaging to potential rival former Vice President Joe Biden, having to do with his son. So that's kind of the big picture here. What did you just hear that sheds any light on that central allegation that has now caused House Democrats to launch an impeachment inquiry?
Well, Savannah, obviously there's going to be a lot of individuals within the Donald Trump world, within the White House, his outside attorney, Rudy Giuliani, who will be focused very closely on every one of the words there. I was struck a little bit by that word favor here, which may indicate that the president had no expectation of anything in return. The president himself repeatedly in recent days has said there was never any quid pro quo. There was no quid pro quo. And his explanation has shifted here. Initially, he said the reason for withholding that money was in order to make sure that there was an investigation of some kind into Ukrainian bureaucratic corruption. Then yesterday he said it was because he wanted to make sure that European countries were doing their fair share, giving enough money to Ukraine as well. The EU, for its part, says it's done plenty, giving more than $15 billion worth since 2014 here. But let's just step back a little bit. And on this sort of historic 24-hour period, we have certainly heard from the president irritation and frustration. The president lashing out on Twitter at House Democrats, effectively saying that they are overstepping their bounds here, that they have gone too far. The president's allies and friends have been telling me that they believe this will work in his favor, that in effect it will secure his reelection. The president said as much yesterday. This is certainly a political gamble for Nancy Pelosi here, but for the president, it's also a significant irritant. Recognize just 2 days ago, we heard from President Trump here at the United Nations saying that he basically deserved the Nobel Peace Prize. Now he is one of just 4 American presidents facing the prospect of impeachment. Savannah?
Okay, and we just received actually what Pete Williams has been looking at, which is this now unclassified by the president note, which is, it looks like a transcript, but is not technically a transcript. It's a note of the call, and I've got Andrea Mitchell with me by my side here, and you're starting to look at it as well. I mentioned this big picture issue of whether or not the U.S. had withheld military aid, and then a week later had this conversation in which a favor was asked by the president, according to these notes. Should mention that there was no mention of military aid on this call. Where do we stand with this? And the role of Rudy Giuliani in particular, the president's personal lawyer.
That is going to be central to this whole issue, because you would not expect the president to say, I am withholding military aid and I want you to do this. It was never going to happen. But when he says, I want you to do me a favor, and raises the issue of a prosecutor. In fact, that prosecutor was viewed by the European Union, the United States, all of the professionals in the international arena as not doing enough on corruption. That prosecutor was the problem. It wasn't that he was aggressively looking into the Bidens. It was that he was not doing enough to root out Ukrainian corruption. So Biden was following the policy. Joe Biden, then vice president, was following U.S. policy in going after that prosecutor. So the president is really crossing a line in raising Biden at all with the new president. They had not ever talked.
You mean separate and apart from whether or not there was any quid pro quo and military aid? Just like looking at this document on its own, you you say
there is a lot,
problematic?
there are a lot of problems here. That, as well as that initial paragraph, seems to be asking him, do me a favor, asking him to find a Hillary Clinton email connection to the origins of the Mueller probe.
Yes.
That's what he's really, because Ukraine, Manafort was representing the Ukrainian opposition, the pro-Russian government that was ousted.
It's not explicit, but the context certainly suggests that's
people have analogized this kind of conversation to when, you know, a godfather would say, you know, I want you to do something. Everyone knows what is involved here. The president of Ukraine, a small country beleaguered by Russia, congressionally mandated weapons, $400 million are withheld just days before this call. Then the call takes place. And then only afterwards, in recent days, when this becomes explosive, is the money released.
Real quick, though, the president says, oh, the reason I withheld that money is because I'm looking for Europe to pay its fair share, and it has nothing to do with this.
And that is factually incorrect. Yes, the European institutions spent twice as much, $400+ million in that year, more than the $200 million provided by the United States. It's just factually wrong.
Okay, so let me turn back to Pete Williams, who has also looked at this and looked at it first, looked at it longer. But Pete, on this very narrow issue, because Andrew is talking about some of the perhaps ethical improprieties with the context and the content of this call, you mentioned that the Department of Justice was asked and referred a case that was very narrow to look at whether there was a crime here, whether the crime of a campaign finance violation was met, so whether or not the elements of a particular statute was met. But it's important to point out, they do not, in this document, see a campaign finance violation or presumably any other crime, which is different than the matter of impeachment we know.
Well, absolutely right, for two reasons. Number one, impeachment is a largely political exercise, not a legal one. So while the Constitution speaks of high crimes and misdemeanors, that's never been defined by any court. It's up to Congress to make that decision. So impeachment is a political punishment, not a legal one. Secondly, Nancy Pelosi in her remarks yesterday said that the failure of the Intelligence Committee's Inspector General to be able to communicate this letter from the whistleblower to Congress, that the Justice Department's opposition to that was a violation of the law. This is the Justice Department's answer to that. They're saying, no, it didn't violate the law, because what the law says is we pass along whistleblower complaints under this specific statute when they relate to an intel community person or activity, and this was neither. This was a diplomatic call by the president, and by the way, they said administrations of both parties throughout the years, and they cite some language from the Clinton administration and Janet Reno, have asserted that diplomatic calls are entitled to executive privilege. So for various reasons, they say it wasn't illegal to not pass this letter along. But what the point they made this morning is it didn't end there, that it went to the Justice Department and they looked at whether it was a criminal violation for the president to say this to Zelensky, and concluded it was not.
Okay, Pete, I should mention House Speaker Nancy Pelosi just said she was at the stakeout camera position outside her caucus meeting, and she said, and unclear to me whether or not this is after having heard about this transcript, but she says just now, the fact is that the president is in breach of his constitutional responsibilities, has asked a foreign government to help him in his political campaign at the expense of our national security, as well as our undermining the integrity of our elections. That cannot stand. He will be held accountable. No one is above the law. Let me go to Jeremy Bash. He was the chief of staff at the Pentagon, and as well as the CIA in the Obama administration. I'm assuming you're up to date and up to speed as much as the rest of us are on what the call was about. What do you take from this?
Hey, Savannah, what's jumping off the page to me on the bottom of page 2 of this transcript that was just released is that the president of Ukraine says the following: I would like your great support in the area of defense. We are ready to continue to cooperate for the next steps to buy more javelins. Those are man-portable, anti-tank, fire-and-forget weapons that the United States was going to be sending to Ukraine. The president of Ukraine says, where are the javelins? Where is the defense support you're giving us? We need it for, quote, defense purposes, the president of Ukraine says. And the very next sentence by the president is, I would like you to do us a favor. It's not like different parts of the transcript. It is literally the president of Ukraine says, help us with defense, and the president says, I would like you to do us a favor. I don't think it's any more clear than that, Savannah, that this conversation was about a trade, defense support for support politically for the president.
Well, that's very interesting because we were talking about whether there was this week or so passage of time between the withholding of aid by the U.S. for whatever reason and then this subsequent call in which the president raises this favor that he wants the president of Ukraine to do him. But as you now acknowledge here, it's President Zelensky who very much has defense funding and purchasing of weapons on his mind, brings it up. I should mention, you said it's directly after in this document, and it most certainly is. This is not a transcript, so what we don't know is if this was right after they said that or if there was some crosstalk or small talk. In fairness to all, we don't know. By the way, we're waiting for the president, who we're told is going to be making some kind of remark on camera. I want to turn back to Andrea because it says in this call that the president was going to ask the Attorney General, William Barr, and Rudy Giuliani, his personal lawyer, to look into this somehow. Pete talked about Attorney General Barr, according to the Justice Department, having taken no action on this whatsoever. What about Rudy Giuliani, the personal lawyer? Because he's been out on camera talking about this and what he did or didn't do with regard to Ukraine.
And sometimes in the same sentence saying, I did this because of Biden, and then in the next sentence saying, well, I was doing it for the State Department. This just last night on Fox News, and then again speaking today. He's been all over the lot, and the controversy really is from the spring through the summer. Rudy Giuliani was meeting with Ukrainian officials all over Europe and in Ukraine and trying to drum up, first of all, the whole issue of Hillary Clinton behind the Mueller report, which has never been, there's never been a connection there. It was always Manafort representing Ukrainian interests involved with the Mueller report. But most importantly, about Joe Biden. Rudy Giuliani said that he was working on behalf of the State Department to look into Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's involvement in this, and he keeps raising these issues. And now the president is raising it with President Zelensky. We have a series of what now seem to not be coincidental developments. The U.S. ambassador to Ukraine forced out or resigning or fired under pressure very suspiciously during the same period that Rudy Giuliani is claiming that he's representing the State Department. What we have to get to the bottom of was, why was she forced out? Why are other key figures, the person representing Ukraine and Russian interests, Vladimir Putin's interests, very experienced from many administrations, Fiona Hill leaving the National Security Council at the same time, John Huntsman resigning as ambassador to Moscow. There's a lot of smoke here. We don't know the facts.
Would it be odd? I mean, you just showed me a transcript of Giuliani recently, I think in the last day or so, saying he was acting at the behest of the State Department. I mean, in and of itself, would that be somewhat peculiar?
Absolutely.
To have the president's personal lawyer and conducting some government business at the behest of the State Department?
And in the same interview, in the same sentence, he said, no, I was acting as the president's personal lawyer. That's why I have lawyer-client privilege if Congress calls me. It's one or the other. And why is he acting on behalf of the State Department? But he was empowered by a State Department envoy for Ukraine to set up these meetings. Very inappropriate, according to the congressional committees.
All right, let's go to the Hill. That's where the action is at the moment. Jeff Bennett is there. I just read a quote from Nancy Pelosi. I'm sure everyone's poring over this sort of pseudo-transcript, this hearing notes. What are you hearing, Jeff?
Well, I think the top line takeaway that the House Speaker tried to impress upon people yesterday, and she reiterated that in her comments today, is that what the president, this is her view, what the president has already admitted to doing, what was in the public record before the release of this summary of the phone call between President Trump and his Ukrainian counterpart, her view is that that was already enough. And as Pete pointed out, impeachment is the process, the political process of bringing charges of wrongdoing against a president. And in this case, the point that Democrats make is that the bad act was President Trump trying to incite collusion, trying to encourage this foreign counterpart into the service of his campaign to dig up dirt on a political rival, in this case, the Bidens. Savannah.
All right, Jeff Bennett on the Hill. We await remarks from President Trump. If we get them, we will bring them to you live. We've got a lot more on NBCnews.com and MSNBC. My thanks to our colleagues. Most of you will return to more of Today. I'm Savannah Guthrie. This has been an NBC News Special Report.